Hello guys and welcome back to the second part of this week's digitization of the artwork of the week. And this week we have a combination of a crocodile, a penguin and a lion. As you can see on the screen, we did this all on paper. That was on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, because on Monday we do a sketch, and then on Tuesday we will always do the inking, and then Wednesday we get around to the best part. We go to the Copic markers and the pencils or just felt tips to colour the piece of paper or colour the piece on the paper. And then on Thursdays and Fridays I work as much as possible to bring you a digital version of the art of the week. And as because we're still in the mutant series at the moment, the mutant animal series at the moment, I thought we'd still listen to some mutants, the new mutants up in the corner. As you can see in the top right hand corner, you will see Comics Explained, which will be starting very shortly. As we've listened to most of Comics Explained this week, I thought, Comic Historian this week, I thought we'd listen to and watch some Comics Explained. They're a little bit different. They explain what the comic's all about, what the powers do, and why mutants are mutants. Because we're in the mutant series, guys, I thought we'd get it doing and done. My name is Blut084, BLUT084 Art and Games. Don't forget to wait till the end to see some links to go to the other videos about artwork or anything else. We've got some digital art, we've got some VR art, loads of different things. If you don't want to wait around to the end, guys, all you can do is go up into the playlists and check out all of the different content. Have a look around. My name's Blut084.
So as we get into our discussion...
So guys, as we've got the intro sorted, like I said, today we're going to be continuing on where we left off, and we have got the textures and shading to be putting on today. We did all the main and base layers yesterday. We did the sky, we did the background, we did the lion, the penguin and the crocodile. We did put the scales in yesterday, and I'm not too keen on the scales, but as I put more shading into that, you won't see the bad parts to this. Hopefully I can always add a few more here and there, but we're going to be using the texture tools down here in the bottom right hand corner. You'll see them pop up, and I'll try and do that so you can see which tool I'm doing each time. But there are absolutely loads of texture tools, sketching tools, pixel art, paint, ink and effects. From this, again guys, this is completely free, so if you would like this app for yourself, then all you got to do, guys, is leave me a comment down below, and I will leave you a link to where I got this off the internet. It's completely legit, guys. It's not a scam program. It won't break your computer. All you'll need is a computer that works up to about 32-bit CPU and things like that, or 64 is preferred, but you can use a 32-bit computer anyway. That's what I'm using, and I use all tools. I occasionally get a crash, but that's when I add way too much in one sort of place. But that's because of my PC. But yeah, this is completely free, guys. So if you want this for yourself and you want to learn how to use different tools that are very similar to Photoshop, you can do. All you gotta do is, guys, again, is leave me a comment down below. Let's get on with the playlist, and let's get using all of these lovely textures and digital tools for this digital artwork. I'm going to be going through different things. I'll try and tell you what I'm doing as I'm going, but sometimes I just get so into it. So that's why I've always got something playing in the background for you to listen to while I'm drawing.
About the New Mutants, we're going to need to take a step back here, and we're going to need to look at more than simply just the story involving the bird that led into the creation of the New Mutants. We actually need to take a step back and do a little bit of discussion about this channel so far. For those of you guys that were with me from the beginning, we had talked about how over the course of this channel, we were going to be getting into stories. We were going to be getting into things where this channel was going to start moving in a direction where we were going to have to reference back to the old stuff. Now, for those of you guys who are new, you guys didn't know about this. You guys didn't know that this is what we were going to be doing. And so New Mutants is going to be our first step in that direction. This is our first step in a much bigger picture. And the reason why is because the New Mutants is going to allow us to segue into introducing all kinds of new characters into Marvel Comics. The Hellions, Selene, Deadpool. This is going to give us the stories whereby these characters are brought in. And the reason why is because this story was founded and it was created by both Chris Claremont and Louise Simonson. And the reason why was explained to us in Wizard Magazine issue number 24 in August of 1993. And what Louise Simonson had said was that Jim Shooter, who at the time was head of Marvel, wanted to start bringing in all these different tie-ins, wanted to start, creating all these different branch-offs of the X-Men due to the popularity of the X-Men under Chris Claremont. Now, initially, Chris Claremont and Louise Simonson didn't really want to do this. And so what Jim Shooter said was that either they can do it or he'll have somebody else do it in their place. And because Chris Claremont was considered the writer, the one person that could best create a story based on the X-Men, and Louise Simonson had found her niche in X-Factor, it made sense that they would be the two that would collaborate to create a branch off of the X-Men titled New Mutants. Now, in terms of the New Mutants actually coming into fruition, or I guess being created, this was given to us in Uncanny X-Men issues number 155 through 157, and issues number 161 to 167. And what we saw over the course of the stories was an introduction of an alien race called the Brood. Now, the Brood are an alien race that can effectively plant a embryo of sorts into a host, and the embryo will grow. It'll be, it'll develop, and it'll take on both the traits and the appearance of its host, but the host will die in the process. But what the embryo also does is it takes on everything that makes the host what it is. So it takes on their memories. It, for the most part, becomes the host, and it allows that information to be sent back to the hive mind, to the actual Brood Empress, the head of the Brood hierarchy, which in turn can be used to expand the Brood's empire as it seeks to conquer that particular race that it's somehow managed to duplicate. Now, with Uncanny X-Men, we had seen over the course of these stories that the sister of Lilandra, Deathbird, was looking to usurp the throne of the Shi'ar Empire. And so to do that, she had, allied herself with the Brood. But because the X-Men were considered very close to the Shi'ar through Xavier and Lilandra, her goal was to somehow find a way to eliminate the X-Men. And this worked well for the Brood, because the reason that this worked so well was that the Brood could replace the X-Men with Brood replicants, and so they could then turn and undergo the process of conquering the planet Earth. And so what we saw was that over the course of this series, that the concept had come into existence. The idea had come along that the X-Men appeared to have been converted into Brood, and the original X-Men had been killed off. Now, this was from the perspective of Charles Xavier. Now, we know this wasn't the case. We know that Carol Danvers, who at the time was powerless, was experimented on by the Brood. She became the character Binary in Chris Claremont's attempt to rewrite her character. But because Charles Xavier didn't know this, he had believed the X-Men had been killed off. And so initially his idea was to walk away from the concept of having an X-Men team, walking away from his dream of having some sort of group that can fight on the side of mutants and attempt to do what it can to find a democratic and a peaceful way to coexist with humans. But as we'll see throughout the introduction of New Mutants in Marvel graphic novel issue number 4, we'll see that Charles Xavier will begin to change his tune. And this tune will be changed due to a series of circumstances which forced him to come into contact with the New Mutants, but also due to some prodding at the hands of Moira McTaggart. So unlike X Factor or Excalibur or Generation X, where we went into an explanation on the comic that first introduced us to teams, with New Mutants, we're actually going to be skimming over this pretty fast. And the reason why is because we're going to be covering a lot of things over the course of the New Mutants in Marvel Comics in a very short amount of time. And so, as we're introduced to this story, we first pick up with Moira McTaggart. And Moira McTaggart is spending time on the side of a hill, more or less collecting her thoughts, and she encounters apparently a wolf which has leaped over her. And this is a surprise to Moira McTaggart because, as she tells us, wolves haven't been seen in that part of the country for generations. But as things progress, she realizes that this is not an ordinary wolf, that the wolf actually begins to change form. And when it does, it changes into a girl named Rain Sinclair, also called Wolfsbane. And what Moira McTaggart does is she protects Wolfsbane from the people who are pursuing her, individuals who believe that she's somehow a witch or in league with Satan because they don't understand the premise of what mutant powers are. Now, Moira McTaggart is able to vouch for the young girl and able to tell the individuals to back off, which they do. And Moira McTaggart takes Wolfsbane to the only person that she thinks can truly help her, which of course is Charles Xavier. From here, we switch to Robert DaCosta, or Sunspot. And of course, in Brazil, he's in the middle of a soccer game. And as he's in this soccer game, he's being bullied by another one of the players who physically assaults him. Because the referees don't see it and no one makes a call, Robert DaCosta begins to get angry about it, and so he takes things into his own hands. And when he does, his mutant powers begin to manifest as he's taking a beating from the person who was bullying him. And the mutant powers, as they manifest, cause the person who was fighting him to be, blown away. And the people around him begin to panic. Of course, his family, with the exception of his mom, runs off, and she seems to be the only person that's willing to comfort him. From here, we switch to Sam Guthrie, or Cannonball. And of course, he's the son of a coal miner who had previously been killed in a coal mining incident. And while Sam and another coworker are working within the mine, there's a cave-in. And during the cave-in, of course, Sam's powers manifest as he's trying to find some way out for the two of them. Now, what his powers do are allow him to project or catapult himself out of the mine and into the nearby woods. Now, initially, his coworker chalks this up to a miracle, and Sam agrees, although Sam has come to the realization that he's developed abilities and is still trying to figure out how to deal with this. From here, we switch to Danielle Moonstar, to Mirage. And Danielle Moonstar appears to have already had her powers manifested. They seem to have already made themselves known. And of course, she's confronted by her grandfather, who tells her that because of the abilities that she possesses, that her best, choice or her best role here is to go to the Xavier Institute of Gifted Youngsters. And initially, Danielle Moonstar doesn't want to do this. She feels as though that Charles Xavier is an outsider, that he can't understand her people. And Chris Claremont, keeping trends with racial issues and dealing with real-world events in Marvel Comics, of course, takes homage to this when Danielle Moonstar says that Charles Xavier is a white man and that she'll never go with a white man because he can't truly understand her. But of course, her grandfather says that she doesn't really have a choice in the matter, that she has to, that it's really his command that is making this happen. What we also see with Danielle Moonstar is that she has a premonition of sorts where her grandfather is killed. And when she arrives to the scene, she sees that he is dead. And of course, for her, she knows that this wasn't some kind of an accident. She knows that somebody has intentionally done this, that somebody has killed her grandfather. And so for her, this is simply just a matter of a personal vendetta that needs to be solved. At this point, we switch back to the Xavier Institute, and we join Charles Xavier, Wolfsbane, and Moira McTaggart as they're, investigating the powers of a young woman who will go under the name Mirage. Now, this woman is able to, as she explains it, take over the minds of other people and possess them. And when she does, she effectively becomes that person. She knows all their experiences. She knows everything it is that makes them who they are. And so for her, this is an ability that allows her to directly tap in to a person's very essence. Now, initially, Charles Xavier asks her to display her abilities, and at first she's a little hesitant. She's not really sure that she wants to, but Moira McTaggart tells her to go ahead and do it on her, to use her powers on her. And so what Mirage does is she takes over. She possesses the body of Moira McTaggart and becomes Moira McTaggart. And operating under Moira McTaggart, she demonstrates her abilities, tells everybody that this is what happens when she takes over the mind of a person, that she has absolute control of their body. And so Charles Xavier, who's very surprised by this, who is amazed by this, agrees to bring Mirage on as part of this young group of mutants. But from here, this is when we see Charles Xavier begin to second guess himself. This is when we see him more or less debating whether or not this is something that he really wants to get into. Of course, what what Moira McTaggart hints at us here, what she tells us here, I guess figures out along the way, is that Mirage's powers had more or less just developed on their own. They had they had come to her, and she had developed them by herself without any assistance from anybody. And the reason why was because she comes from Vietnam, and during this time, Vietnam was very war torn, and so she had to learn to adapt. She had to learn to use these abilities to her advantage in order to keep her from, acquiescing to the negative environment that was Vietnam at the time. What we also see is that Rain believes that maybe these powers that she has are a curse from Satan. But what Charles Xavier says is that's not the case. The powers she has are natural. It's simply the next step in human evolution, and that it has nothing to do with Satan or any kind of religion whatsoever. It's simply just the way that her body is evolving. From here, we see that Moira McTaggart and Charles Xavier begin to get into this debate. Of course, Charles Xavier is communicating with Moira McTaggart telepathically, and because Charles Xavier has opened this telepathic bridge, Moira McTaggart is able to communicate as well. And what Charles says is that he doesn't want to do this anymore, that the X-Men were like his family, and that with their deaths, he's experienced the death of his family, and so he doesn't want to undergo this process again. But Moira McTaggart says that this is the nature of being an X-Man, that the idea they fight for is more important than their individual lives. And so X-Men will come and go. People will join the X-Men and they will die for the cause because that's the nature of being an X-Man. Moira McTaggart says that this is the whole reason why the team was founded. That Charles Xavier had created the X-Men for the purpose of teaching mutants how to use their abilities, teaching them how to function within normal society, but also having mutants use their abilities in such a way to where they would be superheroes and they would be accepted and they would be able to blend in and bridge a gap between the perception of mutants by humanity and the realistic nature of mutants by humanity. And so from here we see that the group gets a letter in the mail, and the letter they've received is from the grandfather of Daniel Moonstar. The grandfather, of course, is writing to Charles Xavier saying that he would like Daniel Moonstar to attend the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters for her to learn how to control her powers. And so Charles Xavier and the group travel back to the Indian reservation. Now from here we pick up at the actual location in Colorado of this reservation, and when they arrive they realize that Black Eagle, the grandfather of Daniel Moonstar, has been killed. And so the question that Mirage asks here is, what are they going to do? How are they going to be able to find Danielle Moonstar if her grandfather, the only person that knew where she was, is now deceased? But before they can go too much further, they're immediately bombarded by what appears to be a Vietnamese infiltration force, or perhaps something to give them the illusion that they are back in Vietnam. And again, this is simply Danielle Moonstar using her powers, and this is when it's explained to us, for the most part, in any real detail, what it is that she's able to do. Danielle Moonstar is able to cast illusions in the mind of a person, but the illusions are based on empathy, meaning that she's able to tap into the emotions of a person. And so she can create illusions based on their worst fears or based on their happiest moments. It depends on what it is that she wants to do. But being that, as we see with her character, she's being pursued, she's using her ability to cast illusions into anybody around her and to force them to flee. Of course, the forces that are currently chasing her are the forces of Donald Pierce, a member of the Hellfire Club, who is attempting to eliminate all mutants and trying to start with the younger generation of mutants. And of course, as these forces are chasing after her, her mountain lion comes to the rescue. But the mountain lion Ridge Runner is killed almost immediately, and so as a result Danielle Moonstar begins to get angry. But of course, as she's about to be attacked and presumably killed by the forces of Donald Pierce, we see that Mirage comes to her aid. And what Mirage does here is she takes over the mind and body of this particular agent, and when she does, the agent starts killing people. It starts killing the other forces of Donald Pierce. And so with Donald Pierce's forces now more or less eliminated, the group led by Charles Xavier alongside Daniel Moonstar are able to gather together again and able to retreat back to their current location. From here, we transition to the hotel room that Daniel Moonstar, that Karma, and that Moira McTaggart are staying in. And it seems as though these individuals that have appeared are police officers, and the police officers are here to arrest all of these individuals. Now, initially, Moira McTaggart asks why it is the police are here, but she's immediately assaulted for her questioning, and the group is, of course, taken by the police. But what Karma does in the process is she takes over the mind of one of the police officers, and so when the police officer goes to put handcuffs on her, he doesn't actually secure them. The handcuffs are loose, and of course this is done by Karma herself. As soon as the group gets down to the lobby, the police officer that Karma is possessing assaults the second police officer, and the group takes this time to make their escape into a crowd outside of the hotel. From here, the group is transitioned back to the home of Robert DaCosta, and what Robert DaCosta is doing is apparently leaving. Now, of course, the group is following him as they were instructed by Maura McTaggart to do, and the goal here, as far as we can tell, is for them to possibly try to recruit Sunspot. And as they follow Sunspot, they end up in a warehouse in the I guess the slum district of Rio de Janeiro. Now, apparently, as far as we're able to tell, Sunspot had come here and said that he would agree to hand himself over if they would release Juliana, but of course the forces refused to do both. And so what we see as things progress is that while Sunspot tries to use his powers, that he doesn't quite have control of them, and so he is almost immediately overpowered by the forces of Donald Pierce. But before things begin to get too chaotic, Karma again uses her powers Mirage uses her powers to create illusions in the minds of other people to force a multitude of these henchmen to see Wolverine. And of course, Wolverine, during the Uncanny X-Men events with their encounter with the Hellfire Club, had already come into contact with a multitude of these henchmen. And so for them, their worst fear is to actually see Wolverine. And so, of course, with the illusions cast alongside the actions of the remaining members of the New Mutants, they're able to assist in trying to help Robert DaCosta escape. But over the course of the conflict, one of the henchmen tries to shoot Robert DaCosta, and when he does, Juliana jumps in the way. And the result is that Juliana is killed. Now, of course, Sunspot takes this very, very hard, but what we see is that there's some common ground that's found between Karma, Mirage, and Sunspot when Karma and Mirage say that they want to help Sunspot get back at the person that's done this, because the person that has put them in this situation is targeting all of them, and so in a way they can all gain their own revenge. From here, we transition to Charles Xavier and to Wolfsbane, and the two of them are apparently traveling through Kentucky looking for Cannonball. But when they find him, it's actually due to the fact that he has rammed into their vehicle and sent their vehicle toppling over. Of course, Charles Xavier tells Wolfsbane to run, and Wolfsbane, while she initially takes off, thinks that maybe she can turn back around and she can try to help Charles Xavier. But when she looks back, she of course sees that Cannonball is dragging Charles Xavier's body away. Now, Cannonball is apparently working for the forces of Donald Pierce, although at this moment we don't exactly know why. It seems like he is legitimately on the payroll, and so we don't know if he's somehow being coerced or if he's doing it of his own accord. But the group is able to load up Charles Xavier and take Charles Xavier away in a helicopter. From here, we follow Wolfsbane as she is tracking down the helicopter, and this leads her to a compound that's of course surrounded by fences and various forms of security. She's able to get herself past the fences and into the compound itself, and when she does, she looks inside and sees Donald Pierce alongside the henchmen. And what Donald Pierce is doing is he's telling Charles Xavier what he wants to do. Of course, he tells Xavier that his plan here is to, of course, remove Charles Xavier's ability to use his mind to combat any of them, but the other purpose of the devices attached to Charles Xavier is to allow Donald Pierce to use Charles Xavier's mind to locate a multitude of other mutants, which of course he can in turn eliminate. And this is the motivation of Donald Pierce. Donald Pierce, as part of the Hellfire Club, is attempting to eliminate all mutants everywhere, including those who are part of the Hellfire Club, and to move himself up to the very peak of the male position in the Hellfire Club as the Black King. And of course, as Wolfsbane is looking at this, the other members of the New Mutants arrive. But in addition to the arrival of these other New Mutants comes Cannonball. And this is when it's revealed to us that it appears Cannonball really is working for the forces of Donald Pierce of his own accord. And of course, Cannonball is able to knock down Wolfsbane, but as he is getting ready to attack Wolfsbane again, Mirage uses her power to make him believe that he is back in a cave-in, that he's back in the cave, or I guess in the the tunnels in Cameron, Kentucky, and is experiencing a cave-in once more. And so because of his fear, because this is overwhelming him, he takes off. And what the New Mutants do is they use this time to break into the facility to attempt to rescue Charles Xavier. And for the most part, they're largely successful, albeit they're still learning how to use their powers. Over the course of the conflict, we of course see that Karma's trying to use her ability to tap into the mind of Cannonball, but because she's so panicked, because she's so overwhelmed, she's not able to concentrate. And so instead, she simply grabs a machine gun and begins shooting at the forces of Donald Pierce. From here, we transition to the interior of the compound as the New Mutants are making their way in. Of course, Wolfsbane is the first one to attack Donald Pierce, but she's thrown off almost immediately to the side of Charles Xavier and appears to be unconscious. Mirage arrives and attempts to cast illusions in the mind of Donald Pierce, but Donald Pierce says that because he's part cyborg, that these effects don't work on him, that psychic attacks don't affect him, or at the very least, the kind of a psychic attack that she's attempting to use doesn't work on him. From here, we again transition back to the rest of the team as they're going in turn to do what they can to try to defeat Donald Pierce. But while this is going on, Charles Xavier is speaking with Wolfsbane, and he tells her to use the console behind him to turn off the machine that is attached to his head so that Charles Xavier can use his powers. And as we move forward, as we continue with this story, we of course see that Cannonball apparently begins to come to his senses, that perhaps he realizes he's fighting on the wrong side. And when Donald Pierce realizes this, Donald Pierce attempts to kill Cannonball. But before he can, Charles Xavier, whose mind has apparently been released from its control, takes over Donald Pierce. And when he does, while it's a struggle, he overcomes. He's able to effectively shut down the mind, or at the very least take over the mind of Donald Pierce to keep him from killing Cannonball. From here, the story begins to wrap up. We of course see that the New Mutants are able to save Wolfsbane. They're able to overcome Donald Pierce due to the fact that he's now under the control of Charles Xavier, and the group is trying to decide what it is they should do with Cannonball, what it is they should do with him. But the initial idea is to simply just leave him, to let him come to his own terms, and to do what he wants to do. From here, we go back to the Xavier Mansion about two to 3 weeks, maybe a month later, and Charles Xavier is reflecting on the X-Men, the original X-Men, the new generation of the X-Men, and he's come to this realization that he does need to undertake the role of having X-Men. The X-Men need to exist. There has to be someone that can be out there and that can somehow try to bridge the gap between humanity and mutant kind. And so of course we see that the New Mutants are putting on their new uniforms, they're getting themselves dressed, and as they meet with Charles Xavier, we see that Cannonball, that Sam Guthrie arrives, and Charles Xavier tells the New Mutants not to panic, that he invited Cannonball here, that Cannonball had been tricked by Donald Pierce into believing that the New Mutants were the bad guys, but as the story and as the events had progressed, Sam Guthrie had come into his own and realizing that it was really Donald Pierce who was the bad guy. And so as the story comes to a close, we see the New Mutants coming together and greeting Sam Guthrie as their newest recruit. So after Marvel Graphic Novel issue number 4, New Mutants of course got their own solo series with New Mutants issue number 1. And over the course of these comics, we saw a lot of things beginning to change. We saw all kinds of stuff going on with these stories because again, New Mutants was running alongside the X-Men. We saw new people being brought in. We saw Cypher, we saw Magma, we saw Magic, the younger sister of Colossus, Warlock. We saw a lot of these characters coming into play.
Okay, right. So we've got the grass and the trees in the textured layer. I've only used 2 textures. They're obviously different colours, different shades. It does help to use the same tool, but you can do sort of layers on top of layers. And I had to go back over to one of my other layers here. As you can see, I started on this layer here, which is the background A colour. But what I noticed, there was still leaving the detail lines that I put in just for sort of reference lines. So I've gone back over those because I didn't want to delete them, because I sort of like the way that they still are. So I've used those lines as fault lines to make the shading, to put the shading where I want the shading to be. I still think it needs a little bit more, but not too much. So I'm going to sort of leave it here and start moving down a bit more into the sediment area and start putting it as maybe sort of a rocky sort of look. Sorry, no, rock. Sorry, that's mud and that's rock down the bottom. So we'll do mud here, and then we'll do the rock level. And then as I get to sort of here, I'll move over to the other side of the rock here. Because as you see, I've already done a little bit to the water, and I kind of like the way that that wave is coming up, because that's how it does. It is in that picture there. This is the paper version, guys. So this is what I'm sort of going for. I've done this a little bit too high. Maybe I should change that down a bit, actually. It looks alright. I could do that as I'm going around. It would make more sense if I actually did that, but sorry guys, I got hiccups. And hopefully you're enjoying the New Mutants in the background. I'm going to have a sip of tea. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. So yeah, hopefully you're enjoying it in the background. I'm going to continue on now, guys, where I think things need doing. But I'm going to go to the mud, then I'll go to the rock, then I'll go to the rock here, and then we'll start on the main image. I've still got loads of different layers. All these different layers are very important, guys, as you've already seen. You can go underneath lines, you can go over the top of lines, but it's best to stay the detail lines you've already done, sort of do another layer underneath, so you can sort of colour in what you've already done. Sorry, there was somebody texting me. As I said, I've done the texture layers. I can turn all of these off, so if I needed to sort of look to see what I've done without sort of doing it, there you go. There's what I did originally. There's the main thing. I can just get rid of that, and there's the main image. I did take a picture of the inked picture before. What I do, guys, is I go on my tablet and take a picture of my tablet. I take that picture and I take it to this app here. Again, you can, any picture you've pulled off the internet, any picture you pulled from anywhere, any picture that you've been able to download. Anything problem that I'm having a problem with is iPhones. So if you're using an iPhone, it's best to take a picture. Say if you've got a digital camera, if you've got a digital tablet, if you've got anything like that, or a phone that isn't iPhone, it'll basically work. iPhone and this don't seem to match. Or iPhone, you've got to have so many different other things to convert those pictures into to be able to use it with Microsoft, because it's a pain in the ass. So there's one thing you shouldn't use is your iPhone to take pictures for this app here. But again, I took a picture on my tablet, took a picture over here, and outlined it. As you can see here, I outlined it and just copied down what I've already done, really. I'm now going to sort of carry on, but yeah, hopefully you're enjoying it. Listen to the playlist in the background and watching me draw. If you do, guys, don't forget to leave a like, and you can always come over to Instagram if you want to check out this drawing for your own self, if you want to sort of check it out. And again, guys, if you would like a picture that I've drawn, if this one or any of the others, you can ask me over in the comment section down below, and I'll send it out to you, either on a memory stick or via email, depending how big the picture is. It sort of depends how much it will send over. But yeah, if you want it, guys, for your phone, your tablet, or just your back screen on your computer, let me know and I'll send it out, guys. Or if you want a picture, a copy of the paper version, I can take a picture of that one, or I can go to my local shop, get it scanned in, so you can have a full sort of picture, so it's not a picture of a picture, and get it sent out to you as well, guys. So if you do want it, let me know in the comment section down below. Otherwise, I'm going to carry on and get this done.
But in the background, over the course of this series, we also saw things changing with regards to individuals. In 1986, we of course saw the trial of Magneto, something we had touched on in the X-Men Explained video. And with the trial of Magneto, as we had previously discussed, Magneto was turning over a new leaf. And so with Charles Xavier being removed as the leader of the X-Men, Magneto took his place. Now this of course coincided with New Mutants issue number 35 and remained for about 40 issues or so. But again, what we saw over the course of this series and over the course in the background, that Chris Claremont was also launching his own branch-off series, most notably the series of Excalibur. And so with issue number 55 in 1987, Chris Claremont had walked away and the series was turned over to Louise Simonson. But Louise Simonson was also doing X Factor at the same time. And so this is one of the reasons why we had seen characters like Richter and Skids, who were part of X Factor, being folded into the New Mutant story. But over the course of the 3 years which Louise Simonson was writing the series alongside X Factor, the series began to slump. It began to drop off because the very gritty element of the characters, which Chris Claremont was so well known for, began to kind of go away. But by 1991 or so, Rob Liefeld was introduced as part of the New Mutants lineup. Now, at the time, he wasn't necessarily a main creator, or I guess a main creator in the series. He was more like a co-creator of sorts. But by issue number 97, Louise Simonson had more or less been I guess pushed out the door. She wasn't really eliminated from the series, so to speak, but she was certainly being handed her hat. And what Rob Liefeld had done is he had taken these concepts of characters that had previously existed and began to fold them in. And this is when we saw the New Mutants starting to move in the direction of a combination with Cable being introduced and then moving in the direction of the actual X-Force team. We of course saw with New Mutants issue number 98 the introduction of Deadpool. But with issue number 100 in 1991, the New Mutants series was brought to an end. And what it was, the New Mutants themselves were rolled over into the actual group X-Force, which was led by Cable. And this is something that would go on for a number of years until about 2002, when the overall X-Force series began to come to a close. Now, eventually Marvel would bring the X-Force series back. They would reboot it with Uncanny X-Force, but again, this wasn't a series that was wildly well received. And so overall, Marvel brought the whole thing to an end. But again, this is the significance of New Mutants in Marvel Comics. New Mutants allowed us to be introduced to a multitude of different characters, but we saw with the New Mutants aging, with them getting older, that the series grew, the series progressed, new things were being introduced, and Marvel began to segue the entire X-Men, or I guess X-Universe concept into a new direction in the 1990s by crossing it all over into a multitude of different series, ultimately culminating in the 1995 Age of Apocalypse storyline. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.
Ugh! No, thank you.
Express yourself. So fun to dress up. Just be yourself. Got all my friends. Let's show who we are. So many choices. Make our own style. Barbie fashionista dolls and fashion packs. Each sold separately. You can be anything.
They don't let me skip that. What a pain in the ass. Go away, advert. Go away, advert. Go away, advert. Go away, advert. Oh, go away, advert.
Winter mornings
Oh,
are the
God,
same
no,
as
bloody
any other.
Go away!
What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here
Hi,
on my
Rob.
channel, then
Welcome
make sure
back.
you hit the like button, and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So it's been a while since we've done a character explanation. I really kind of miss the idea of doing character explanations, team explanations, but the New Mutants are a really cool concept in the realm of Marvel because they really come out as a byproduct of the X-Men's popularity, which we'll talk about here in a second. But the New Mutants originally appeared in Marvel graphic novel number 4, and they were created by Chris Claremont. Now the whole idea is that this was done in 1982, and this comes hot off the heels of the X-Men's popularity. Remember, back when the X-Men were first created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, when Marvel was launching all these publications in the early 1960s, the Fantastic Four, Thor, Iron Man, Ant-Man, the Avengers, the Return of Captain America, Spider-Man, different things like that, a lot of the comic book readers that were coming to Marvel were already at DC, because a lot of the comic book publishers that existed, they were trying to publish superheroes, had largely faded out by the time World War II came to an end. So from the mid-1940s going all the way up into the early 1960s, if you were reading comics, you were largely reading DC. And so Marvel found its foothold in creating characters and concepts that DC hadn't done before. The problem with the X-Men was that when they originally popped up, they were teenage kids with superpowers. And while the superpower element was new with regards to new, teenage superheroes, for the most part, DC had covered a lot of that stuff. They had basically launched the Teen Titans. And so when the X-Men ran up until about issue number 63, I think it was, Marvel basically stopped printing new stories and just ran reprints until issue number 94. Now in issue number 95, Chris Claremont took over the title after the relaunch of X-Men with Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, and because he focused on the team as more of a soap opera, because he focused more on characters as opposed to adventurous and zany stories like Stan Lee did, the X-Men actually became Marvel's highest selling publication. And so because of that, 7 years after after this relaunch by Claremont, the editor-in-chief at the time, Jim Shooter, basically wanted to launch another X-Men title, something that would basically build on the success of the X-Men itself, but have a wholly different roster. And so what Chris Claremont did is he formed the New Mutants as a throwback to the original X-Men stories that focused largely on the idea of teenage kids who had developed superpowers and were basically trying to figure themselves out in the process. Now, the only caveat to this is a character named Karma, a character named Jian Koi Man, I think is how you pronounce it. I think that's her name, but she had originally appeared in Marvel Team Up number 100 2 years before, so she'd been around for a couple of years before Chris Claremont rolled her into the New Mutants. But because of her experience and the fact that she'd been around for a while, she became the de facto leader. But the long and short of their whole origin is that much like the original X-Men and much like mutants in general, their powers largely manifested in response to a kind of stress of sorts. With regards to the character Wolfsbane, also known as Rain Sinclair, she can literally turn herself into a werewolf. She had previously occupied a place referred to as Muir Island, which was basically the base of operations, the home, more or less, of Moira McTaggart, who had long since been a standing friend of the X-Men, kind of this mutant geneticist, this researcher who was the scientific arm of the X-Men team alongside the, Beast Hank McCoy. Now, of course, Wolfbane gaining her abilities, simply just kind of popping up, comes as a byproduct of mutants at the time, in the sense that there was a lot of hatred for mutants because humanity either didn't like them because they were so powerful, or they didn't understand them. Different philosophical viewpoints went into that, but Rain Sinclair kind of stumbled across the path of Moira McTaggart, and she ultimately ended up basically taking Rain over to Charles Xavier. Now, the same thing happened with Robert DaCosta, a young kid based out of Brazil, who basically manifested the ability to absorb solar energy and turn it into a physical strength. Cannonball Sam Guthrie from Kentucky, much the same way, absorbs solar energy, kind of is able to put off this thermal energy that allows him to fly. But this is how these characters began manifesting their abilities. It has sort of popped up. Now, one of the big exceptions to this is Danielle Moonstar. When we end up seeing her powers have already popped up, and she basically has the ability to create these sort of empathic illusions, to essentially get people to see things that reflect her emotional state. But the idea is that they were all essentially being targeted by a guy named Donald Pierce. Now, Donald Pierce in the movies is just a guy who works and is part of the project with regards to X-23. There wasn't a whole lot going on to his character in the Logan film. In the comics, he's vastly different. He is basically a member of a group called the Hellfire Club. Now, the Hellfire Club had been around Marvel for quite some time. They were basically one of the various villain groups who had been introduced in the X-Men stories under Chris Claremont in an effort to basically bolster the various enemies for the X-Men to face off against. But for Donald Pierce himself, unlike the other members of the Hellfire Club who possess various powers, Donald does not have any abilities of his own. Instead, he's basically a cyborg of sorts. But the idea was that Donald Pierce was essentially a fanatic who hated mutants. And for the longest time, the Hellfire Club was basically this sort of inner circle of individuals who had the ability to influence the world through money and different things like that. The problem with this was that there was a point along the line when the Hellfire Club was co-opted by mutants. They essentially took over the ranks of the Hellfire Club. Donald Pierce hated this concept, and so the goal was to take the New Mutants, use them for his own cause, to basically take over the Hellfire Club and then get rid of the New Mutants so there wouldn't really be any challenge to his cause. The other half of this was the ongoing stories of the X-Men at the time, in the sense that the X-Men were experiencing this wax and wane under the writing of Chris Claremont. Specifically, there were a handful of things that had taken place. The X-Men were basically off in space fighting the Brood. They were believed to have been dead. Jean Grey had already sacrificed herself during the events of the Phoenix Saga. She was believed to have been dead. These kind of things hit Charles Xavier in a way where he basically felt like he was a failure as a leader, as a father figure, as a teacher, and so he ultimately didn't want to teach the New Mutants. But Moore McTaggart effectively persuaded him to this cause, and the result was that he ended up taking up arms, teaching the New Mutants as a new generation of heroes who could in turn develop their own fan base and their own core group of readers. The other half of this is that with the conclusion of the origin story for New Mutants, the defeat of Donald Pierce and so on and so forth, the idea of Marvel was to look at the success of New Mutants in terms of the actual origin, to gauge audience reception by way of letters, pages, sales, different things like that, and then decide whether or not they were actually going to get a publication, which they did in March of 1983 with New Mutants Volume 1, Issue Number 1. Now, again, with Chris Claremont continuing the story, over the course of the first 7 or so issues, there was a little bit of reshuffling in the sense that Claremont was really just kind of teasing the waters to see how people would respond to different scenarios, explicitly with the death of Karma. Now, the idea was that she did not really die per se. She was essentially possessed by the Shadow King. She eventually was used by the Shadow King to go on and become a gangster, but it allowed Danny Moonstar and Cannonball to take over a leadership role in the team. Now, again, going on after the first 7 issues or so, over the course of the next 7, usually, between issues 8 and 14, there were some things that were sort of being juggled around and some actions that were being taken by Claremont in an effort to continue bolstering up the readership. As a really good example, we actually ended up seeing them come into contact with the Hellfire Club, but instead of seeing them battle the Hellfire Club, instead, Chris Claremont created a younger version of the Hellfire Club, which are referred to as the Hellions. Now, this was huge for a lot of comic book readers at the time, because while Charles Xavier believed the X-Men were dead, individuals who were reading Uncanny X-Men knew they weren't. And so what it did is it gave fans the best of both worlds. Because of that, some new changes were made to the publications over the course of issues 8 to 14. We saw the introduction of characters like Cypher, who is basically a guy that could understand any language, whether it was written or spoken. The character of Magic, Ileana Rasputin, which incidentally, as the sister of Colossus, is her first major comic book introduction in terms of anything past her origin in Giant Size X-Men number 1. We saw all these things going on with these characters, these new roles being introduced, these characters being allowed to stand on their own 2 feet, and fans were very much receptive to it because Claremont focused just as much on the storytelling of the individual characters as he did with the team itself. At the same time, when it came to comic book publications under Marvel, for the most part, the only real science fiction thing that you saw was usually whatever stories involved the Fantastic Four, who may have been exploring other parts of space, or Doctor Strange. And so when New Mutants came along and they were basically blending in science fiction and fantasy, it was a great throwback to the 1950s, to an era of comics that a lot of readers were nostalgic for, but hadn't actually lived in. People loved New Mutants. Now, at the same time, Chris Claremont was also focusing on things like sort of this redeeming story of Magneto, in the sense that with Uncanny X-Men issue number 200, the trial of Magneto, that Charles Xavier had essentially been taken away by the Shi'ar Empire, a spacefaring race that had already been established in the X-Men series at the time, and then Magneto himself took over leadership of the X-Men. Now, the problem with this was that in a lot of ways, existing members of the X-Men had basically left, but the benefit to New Mutants fans was that they were basically teenagers doing what teenagers did. Where Magneto laid down rules, Magneto said, here's what you can and can't do, the New Mutants would feature stories where they would basically break out, escape the school, they would go on adventures, they would save their friends from all these different threats, and a lot of teenage readers could live vicariously through them. The problem with this was that because New Mutants proved itself to be so wildly popular among readers, because of the fact that the X-Men itself was still wildly popular at the time, and Chris Claremont was the de facto X-Men guy, Marvel began tasking him him with the role of launching new titles, new publications. And so ultimately, Wolverine was a standout star of the Uncanny X-Men line. And so he ended up getting his own solo series under Chris Claremont, as well as the introduction of Excalibur, the British superhero team. And so as a result, Claremont actually took a break from New Mutants with the intention of coming back, and the line was handed over to Louise Simonson. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this coincides with the return of Jean Grey, which is to say, because Jean Grey had basically died as the Phoenix, and because she was so incredibly popular in both the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas, fans wanted to see her make her return. But Jean Grey, alongside Cyclops, Angel, Beast, and Iceman, had broken off from the original X-Men team and focused on basically a team of their own titled X-Factor. And so with New Mutants serving as a younger, more vibrant companion to both Uncanny X-Men and the X-Factor line, the roster was bolstered even more. And so things began to grow at an almost rapid pace. I mean, we saw things like Rusty Collins, Richter, Skids. We saw these characters being brought in and being rolled over into the landscape, and things beginning to basically, shuffle and grow and increase even more. Now, depending on who you talk to, there is basically this idea that Louise Simonson was essentially making Marvel unhappy in terms of her writing. Marvel, because of the events of the death of Gwen Stacy in 1971, the idea of the Dark Knight Returns, Marvel ended up moving in this direction of crafting stories that were darker, that were more gritty. Over under Mary Jo Duffy, with regards to Power Man and Iron Fist, for example, she was writing comedic stories, which Marvel didn't like. So they fired her. They replaced her with Kurt Busiek. He did the same thing. They fired him. Then they brought in Christopher Priest, who killed off Iron Fist, and then basically ended the publication with issue number 125. Louise Simonson had come along and basically said, it seems to be the exact same thing that's going on with regards to the New Mutants line. And so because of that, she ultimately gave up with issue number 97. And the result is that when she walked away, Rob Liefeld and Fabian Nicieza were brought in, and they essentially relaunched the entirety of the New Mutants line. Now, this only lasted for about 3 issues, about 3 or 4 issues, issues 97 through 100. And the idea was to basically finish out the New Mutants line and then cancel the title as it existed and relaunch it as something else. But under Liefeld and under Nicieza, because of the fact that the early 1990s saw this huge paradigm shift in comics, in the sense that things were becoming high octane, things were becoming extremely fast paced, and things were really moving in the direction of being like this, super futuristic, which is one of the reasons why you see a lot of characters from Marvel Comics in the early 1990s wearing headpieces and having a lot of gear that makes them look impossibly large and things like that. But with Louise Simonson leaving in issue number 7 and Rob Liefeld and Fabian Nicieza taking over, a lot of the existing plot lines that she had going were effectively abandoned, with Rob Liefeld and Nicieza picking up the slack. And so where the futuristic son of Madeline Pryor and Cyclops, Cable, had actually appeared in New Mutants number 87 in March of 1990, while he was created by Louise Simonson, the plot threads that she had going in terms of the overall arc that she wanted to do with him were effectively abandoned. So where he had initially just sort of shown up as this guy from the future that nobody really knew anything about, under Liefeld and Nicieza, everything was effectively reworked. And so the original New Mutants roster, or at least as it had evolved with regards to Boom Boom, Rusty Collins, Richter, Skids, those guys, it eventually went away. And instead, they were replaced by Domino, Feral, Shatterstar, and Warpath. Now, of course, this goes into like the origin of Deadpool, the fact that the version of Domino that we saw was not actually Domino. Instead, it was a character named Copycat who was impersonating Domino. These are the kind of things that eventually went on in those stories. But the problem with this was that with issue number 100 canceling New Mutants and the stories being relaunched, while the stories were initially extremely popular, the problem with this was that the value of New Mutants began to go away. Because of the fact that X-Men Volume 2, issue number 1 continued to be one of the highest selling comic books of all time, because Uncanny X-Men saw Chris Claremont leaving within the first 10 issues, I think it was, Jim Lee leaving shortly after, we ended up seeing all these things coalescing to the point where Marvel was running headlong into the mid-1990s comic bust, with a lot of their stories losing their value. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the 1990s comic bust was basically a byproduct of the fact that people believed the value of comics would rise forever. And so they just went out and bought a whole bunch of comics thinking that they would just hold value for years and years and years and years. The result is that comic book publishers began flooding the market with comics, believing that they were just ever more popular, when in reality, fans were artificially inflating the market. Now, DC, Valiant Comics, all these companies were affected by the mid-90s comic bust, but DC was backed by Warner Brothers. Marvel was not, which meant that if their stories ultimately went under, they would have shut their doors, or they would have had to sell out to somebody. But back during this point in time, because the sci-fi escapades, the alternate realities, all these science fiction elements had basically gone away in favor of a series of stories that just dealt with super high action, high octane events, ultimately meant that X-Force began to kind of go away. Running into 2002, it remained relatively popular. The problem with this was that things began to drop off. And so ultimately, Marvel had to begin going through and start making concessions as to what comic books were going to last the longest to ultimately become successful. And so beginning in 2003, under Nunzio Phillips, I think is how you pronounce his name. I believe that's who it was. New Mutants was basically relaunched, and the idea was to keep X-Force going, but to focus on the concept of New Mutants as basically this new modern era of characters who would basically begin going through and running through their own stories. The funny thing about this, though, was that it was not initially launched on its own. Instead, what ended up happening is that with Grant Morrison being brought in by Marvel Comics after his run on JLA in 1998, as well as things like, Doom Patrol and so on at DC Comics, he was tasked with relaunching the X-Men in 2001. And so writing the stories as New X-Men and the Academy X #2 spinoff, the New Mutants were basically reintroduced as Volume 2. And so ultimately, again, under Nunzio, we ended up seeing everything sort of brought back. We saw new characters being introduced, existing characters coming back, so the roster grew to include people like Elixir, this Omega level mutant that can basically heal anybody from any kind of harm they might sustain. We saw all these things being brought in. The problem with this was that seeing a younger generation of superheroes was not new. The stories had to be done in a way that drew people in. The problem is that these stories, as they were written, didn't really do a whole lot to keep the readership there. And so ultimately, it ended up lasting around 13 issues up until 2004, when Marvel launched House of M. Now, the idea of House of M was to basically look around under the editor-in-chief leadership of Joe Quesada, to look around and simply say, the X-Men landscape has grown too large and too unruly. There's too many mutants out there, and it takes away from the ability to tell compelling stories. Marvel came back and just reduced the mutant population by a huge amount, essentially saying that of the 100 and however many students there were at the Xavier Institute, only like 20-something actually kept their powers. And so what this did is it allowed Marvel to focus back down on the New Mutants landscape as it existed, after the events of House of M, and tell more compelling stories. Now, in truth, the New Mutants, for the most part, vanished after that. What Marvel ended up doing is they came back in 2009 and they effectively relaunched it under Zeb Wells. It was really just kind of going back to the core roster, to really the most popular roster as it existed, by combining the first two groups of the New Mutants. So we basically ended up getting Cannonball, Karma, Magma, Danny Moonstar, and Sunspot coming together to help reform the team. This really just kind of existed alongside the events of like X-Furnace, so on and so forth, these stories. The idea that the X-Men had basically left the United States, taken up residence in Utopia off the coast of San Francisco. And so again, the idea was to bolster the stories, to keep them tied into existing things, and then in turn, keep the New Mutants title popular among readers. Again, the issue here is that we ended up seeing the New Mutants line begin to lose popularity yet again when we started seeing events like Second Coming and the new generation of mutants who were brought in after New Mutants, called Generation Hope, under Hope Summers, the first mutant born after the events of House of M. And so because the late 1990s going into the 2000s and the 2010s was basically just this giant hotbed, this huge mess when it came to like all these different X-related titles, ultimately the value of the New Mutants line again began to fade because the characters just weren't really compelling anymore. At the end of the day, it just never really seemed to serve a unique purpose. And so ultimately, Marvel's last attempt to really revisit the New Mutants line came during the events of X-Men Schism. And this was a story that basically dealt with the idea that Wolverine and Cyclops had two distinctly different ideologies in terms of how the X-Men should be led. And so ultimately they had this feud of sorts, they ended up splitting. That led into a story called Regenesis, which basically gave us the Jean Grey School of Higher Learning under the leadership of Wolverine, and then Utopia under the leadership of Cyclops. And for the most part, the younger mutants who were being trained by Wolverine, we saw some of them stay with him, we saw others staying with Cyclops. And so the New Mutants didn't really exist anymore were. They were just kind of, younger mutants who were being trained by both sides, both of whom had completely different ideologies. But again, I just wanted to kind of throw this out there, throw a little bit of tidbits of information out there for you guys with regards to the New Mutants landscape. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, kind of a lot to throw at you guys. But there is a lot of interesting history there, so it's kind of weird getting back on the horse and doing character explanations again. But with that being said, guys, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Peace. Pause that there. We'll pause that there quickly, guys, and show you quickly what I've gone up to. As you can see, I've had a bit of trouble with the rocks. I'm just basically going to leave it there. I do occasionally, sometimes in the evenings, once I've finished sort of recording, I look at it, I keep it on the screen and sort of tweak it here, tweak it there. So that's probably what I'll do with the rocks and stuff. But I want to start on with the lion, the penguin, and the crocodile sort of scales, shading and things like that on there now. I've just put a little bit of overtone on a penguin because, well, a penguin's black and white, and that's just shade. Black and white is the two shades that you got. You got the spectrum between dark and light in black and white. So it's there isn't much I can do to the penguin. So what I've done is just put a little bit of grey over the dark black for the penguin, and that's basically all I'm going to do for that one, because that's basically all I feel like I need to do for that. The lion is going to be a little bit more because he's obviously got, or she has got, a fur or a large mane, which is what I'm working on now. I'm going to be putting a different tone colour to the mane than I am to the face itself. The face is probably going to stay the same colour, just with a bit darker tone over the top to sort of give it a sort of a realistic, semi-realistic look, because I'm still not quite there yet. I heard a motto, which I'm sort of carpe dieming it, and it's finished but not good. So that's sort of what I'm going for at the moment. It's going to be finished but not good, or it's going to be as good as I am and my ability is at this time as I'm speaking to you. I have been drawing since I have been a sort of kid, really. Used to live in hospital basically, and sort of they gave me paper and I started to draw. And ever since then, I've loved to draw. I used to have comics that taught me how to read and things. I learned how to actually read through comics, because books in school never really sort of worked for me. But that's not to say, guys, not to keep going on with your books and keep reading what's there. Because out should be like me, and you'll get to the age of 18, 19, 20 and still not maybe able to read. I'm in my 30s now, thank God I've learned how to read since then. But working helped me do that, and my son, because he came along and I thought I wanted to read him books when he went to bed, so I learned how to read. But we're on drawing today, so we're going to be carrying on with drawing. Again, it's one of those things that I've done throughout my life. I've never really not drawn. I did stop for a good couple of years, which is why my talent isn't as good as it used to be, which is annoying. But I'm trying to break into the digital sort of area of artwork now, hence why I've got this app. Yeah, so I'm going to be carrying on with the line here, getting on a little bit more detail. Still not completely happy with the background, but like I said, finished but not good. So let's get it done. We'll get a bit of fur on the tail there as well, and maybe do some scales and get done as much as possible, because I know now excuse me, we've just hit an hour now, so I'll try and get as much done as possible, and maybe make a third video, so it's obviously not too much for you guys to watch all in one go. Are you guys enjoying yourself? Don't forget to leave a like if you are, and let me know if you in the future what animals or what creations you want in the future. I've already got a request for next week, so don't forget to tune in for that one, as we'll start the sketch on paper next week on Monday, and then on Tuesday we'll go into inking. Wednesday will be the colouring of the paper part, and then on Thursday and Friday we'll be doing this, but with a different animal. So don't forget to hit subscribe, guys, and ding the bell so you don't miss out on what will be going on. And don't worry, guys, if you can't watch it live, anything that I do live stays on my channel, so you can watch it back at any time, at anywhere. You can watch it on your phone, tablet, or even in the bath. So don't forget to tune in when you feel like it. If you want tips and hints, then all you gotta do, guys, is let me know in the comment section down below on this video, and then the next one I'll try and add those techniques that I've learned, and if you have trouble with, then I will try and help you as best as possible. I will be doing some more VR art. I'm not sure when. I might do it tonight, I might do it over the weekend, I'm not sure, guys. It's sort of a chill out thing for me, so I sort of do it in the evenings or sporadically. VR art is very, very good, so don't forget to check them out on my channel, guys, and keep watching. I'm going to get on with that playlist and we'll listen to some more Commons Explained.
Business leaders should be thinking about international trade because we're entering a period in which there are likely to be higher tariffs, which are taxes on what's being...
What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Bam! Yes, RobCore rings. If you guys are interested in having one, check out the link in the description. It'll go to patreon.com/comicsexplained. I have a system there, a reward system, and it is the only real way I could figure out to give the things away equitably. Anyway, yeah, feel free to check that out. So, X-Force Explained. Alright, I was going through my list of teams and things we've talked about. We've talked about New Mutants, we've explained New Warriors, we've talked about X-Men on a couple different occasions. We've explained the Avengers, I'm pretty sure, Justice League, all that stuff. We've never explained X-Force. And, well, really, now's the only time to ever do it. There'll never be a better time to explain X-Force than with the release of Deadpool 2. X-Force is a really intriguing team. X-Force is a really interesting situation. So, a lot of people would say that X-Force made their debut back in 1990, 1991 with X-Force Volume 1, Issue Number 1. But that's actually not true. In reality, X-Force goes all the way back to New Mutants. And the reason why is because the New Mutants line of stories are basically designed to kind of give us this reworking of the X-Men, kind of like a new generation of X-Men, since the original team was believed to have been killed, or at least the Uncanny X-Men were believed to have been killed. And it was just a way to spin out a new X-Men title because the team was so popular. Originally, it was written by Chris Claremont, then it was taken over by Louise Simonson, and then towards the end of her writing, Rob Liefeld came on. Now, with regards to Rob Liefeld's run, and this is really where the X-Force concept starts to take off, you essentially kind of pick up with like issue number 86 or so. And the reason why was because that's when Liefeld really came on and actually became writer for the X-Force line of stories. And the way this worked was that in the mind of Liefeld, you know, looking at the interviews and so on, in the mind of Liefeld, the biggest struggle that the New Mutants had is that they were reminiscent of an age of comics that didn't really apply anymore, in the sense that you had the New Mutants just kind of being teenagers who were under the watchful eye of Xavier, and there were some great stories early in the beginning, and then you had things like the New Mutants who were taken over, or really the X-Men universe more or less. The role of Xavier was replaced with the role of Magneto due to the fact that Xavier was removed from the landscape. And while those stories worked, the reality is that towards the end of the New Mutants run with issue number 100, sales were waning and they were basically dropping off. But they started to experience a kind of resurgence as you got from issue number 86 running up to issue number 100. And the reason for this is when Rob Liefeld took over, his idea was amp the team up, make them a lot more hardcore. And the reason for that was because there was ample evidence to indicate that's the direction people wanted stories to go in. And there were a lot of stories to indicate that that was the case. I mean, you had 1971's The Night Gwen Stacy Died, you had Frank Miller's entire Daredevil run, you had Batman The Dark Knight Returns, you had Batman Year One, you had a lot of stories that were coming out around that time that were a lot darker, that were far edgier, that were moving away from kind of like the wholesome, somewhat dark, you know, interim period between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's original runs on the various Marvel characters and what basically became the 1990s. And so when Rob Liefeld sat down, he basically started moving the story in a direction that made it darker and made it more hardcore. And this came with the introduction of Cable. Now, originally, Cable was just super obscure. You didn't know anything about him. And in fact, you didn't really learn anything about Cable until May of 1993, really, when his solo series first picked up, and even then, like, it was a little questionable. But sticking to X Force and kind of not focusing too much on Cable, since we already have a Cable explained video, is sticking to X Force. The idea was taking this New Mutants group of teams and basically beefing them up. And so over the course of the the final 14 issues or so, you started getting things like the introduction of Domino, the introduction of like copycat characters like that. The idea that like the team was basically being moved away from the whole idea of New Mutants functioning under the watchful eye of Charles Xavier. And so when X-Force Volume 1, Issue number 1 picked up, when it was first released, it was massive. I mean, it was absolutely huge. And there are a couple reasons for why this is the case. The first reason is because it was a wholly new X-Men title. X-Force never existed, right? I mean, X-Men Volume 2, Issue number 1, the highest selling comic book of all time, that was the second volume of the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby run. But that was huge because the Uncanny X-Men had been made a massive publication by the writing of Chris Claremont. You've had like different iterations of the Avengers, and you've had different Avengers stories over the years, Avengers Forever and New Avengers and things like that. But X-Force was brand new. There was nothing like it. Now, there were a few things that had happened before that in terms of other publications that have been released, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But because it was so huge, it immediately drew the eye of everyone. It drew the eye of the entire X-Men universe, because the reality was that in the late 80s and the early 90s, if a title had X attached to it, it sold. That's just the way it was, because X-Men were so popular. So it immediately drew the eyes of the comic book reader, and then it drew the eyes of the comic book collector, because it was the first issue of a series that had never existed before. And so like it just exploded in popularity. Now, for Rob Liefeld's worth, he wrote it for about the first 9 issues. But really, I would say the brains behind the operation on the original X-Force title was a guy named Fabian Nicieza. Now, Fabian Nicieza was a person who had a long-standing history with Marvel. He'd been writing for quite some time. Back in 1989 with Thor 412, editor-in-chief Tom DeFalco launched the New Warriors. And it was basically just kind of like a spin-off group. It was Young Avengers before Young Avengers, with some New Mutants themes thrown in terms of like how they related to each other and so on. But it was relatively popular. Fabian Nicieza wrote it for the first 53 issues, between 1990 running up to 1994. And I mean, he did fine. It was a fine job. He did things like writing Avengers Spotlight. Let's see, he wrote like Classic X-Men, which were basically like the old school Uncanny X-Men stories that were reprinted with a few more goodies and tidbits that were thrown in that weren't originally there to kind of help flesh those stories out a little bit more. He had a huge standing history in that. And so with regards to his role, he was basically a scripter, meaning that he was the one behind the scenes saying, here's the general outline for the direction the story is going to go, and then Rob Liefeld would just kind of fill it in with writing and art and so on and so forth. But because Rob Liefeld left in the first 9 issues, the entire run of X-Force was handed over to Fabian Nicieza. And the reason why this matters is in Marvel Comics and even DC Comics, it was a long-standing rule that when a creator created a character that was part and parcel to that universe, it basically belonged to whoever that publisher was. And there were a few landmark cases that came out of this. For example, you had Steve Gerber, who sued Marvel over Howard the Duck. We talked about that in, I think, the Howard the Duck Explained video. There were different things like that that went into the whole idea of how creators were perceived. That led to a lot of frustration, because you had a lot of characters, or a lot of creators who were basically told, hey, look, you can write Captain America, but only in this small sphere. You can't branch out of that sphere. You can't write him in a way that's not been normally depicted. Like a story like Secret Empire never would have happened in the early 90s, even the late 80s. Like, you would never see a story like that, because adjusting Captain America in that way was a huge no-no. And so what this did is it led to writers and even artists like Alan Silvestri and Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee, and a lot of Marvel's, really their top talent in the early 90s, just jumping ship. They bailed out, they went to Image, and the rest is history. And so with the whole idea of X-Force falling to Fabian Nicieza, in his mind, from what I gather in the interviews, he didn't want to be seen as a poor man's Rob Liefeld. And Rob Liefeld's writing style and art had made X-Force huge, because you were talking about people being drawn in such a way that they were massive in size. Not only that, the big differentiation between X-Force and New Mutants is that New Mutants were just kind of like the new X-Men in training. X-Force was immediately taken over, really like when Cable showed up, he immediately took over the team and said, you guys are basically going to be like a strike team. That's really what you guys are going to be. You're going to be my personal strike team. team, and they served that role well in the sense that they fought things like the Mutant Liberation Front that was led by Strife. They fought, what was it, the Right, I think it was. They fought like a lot of these really hardcore militant groups, because the focus of X-Force and the latter stages of the New Mutants was, we're fighting for mutant rights, and we'll do whatever we have to do to win. And it was pretty sadistic. You take that and you bring in elements like you saw in New Mutants number 98 with the introduction of Copycat, basically a character like Mystique whose powers are far more advanced. You can even copy the powers of others. The introduction of Deadpool. You talk about like all these things that kind of fold into the beginning of New Mutants, the beginning of X-Force with Rob Liefeld, and it was a recipe for success. But when Rob Liefeld left, all eyes turned to Nicieza. And when Nicieza took over, his immediate response was shift everything up. And so what we got in really within the first year of the events of X-Force number 1 is we got a story called Executioner Song. Now, in reality, Executioner Song crossed over all the X-Men titles. So, X-Men Volume 2, Uncanny X-Men, X-Factor, X-Force, I mean, it crossed over all of them. And it was essentially bringing in, like, these little tidbits of Cable's history. And so what you ended up learning is that at some point in the future, Cable will have a clone. And that clone will not be hindered by a techno-organic virus, which Cable has, that tries to convert his living tissue into machinery. And where Cable has to use his telepathy and telekinesis to keep that virus from quite literally eating him alive, Strife doesn't. And so Strife basically came back in his war against Cable, which had been going on for thousands of years, tried to assassinate Professor X, and done all these horrible deeds while impersonating Cable. And so the idea was that Cable and X-Force are deemed too extreme and too dangerous, and we're just kind of, scuttled and locked away by the rest of the X-Men universe. And then the Executioner Song crossover continued on, running until X-Force issue number 18. Now, the reason why this matters is because what Fabian Nicieza wanted to do was rework the team in its entirety in his image and not continue Liefeld's work. And so in issue number 18, Cable was killed off. Basically, it was this climactic battle between himself and Strife, and they were just thrown into the time stream. And as far as I'm aware, they were never supposed to be seen or heard from again. And so following that, going into the future of the X-Force comics, while Cable did return in issue number 25, during that interim period, during that 7 issues, Nicieza basically crafted the stories in such a way that 1, the team immediately broke off from the X-Men, and 2, they went to go try to figure out who they were. And this resonated with a whole lot of fans, because what it did is it kind of covered this interim period. And in fact, there's a guy named Brett White who wrote a really good article on Comic Book Resources talking about this, which I'll link down in the description. But to basically, because I really can't say it better than he did, to kind of reiterate his point, not a lot of comic books focus on I'll take that back. A lot of comic books focus on the interim period, like where you have young kids who gain their powers and they're taken under the wing of any particular superhero group. They're taken under the wing of the Avengers in the case of Young Avengers. They're taken under the wing of the X-Men in the case, or I guess under Xavier, in the case of any of the X-Men titles. Like you see that a lot. What you don't see is the interim period when they walk away. And that's what X-Force under Fabian Nicieza basically showed us. It had the X-Force essentially saying, our leader is gone, but we're not New Mutants anymore. We're not little kids. We're going to go out and forge our own path. And that's what those 7 issues focused on. And so when Cable came back in issue number 25, everything was totally different. And the stories kind of gravitated and pushed themselves in a way where you kind of had this line of publications, or really like this overarching plot, where Cable was trying to be the Xavier of X-Force, and they wouldn't accept it. They were like, you can work with us, but we're not going to work for you. Like that's the way this whole thing transpires. There were a lot of other plot threads that went in there in terms of things like like Copycat and Domino and what Deadpool really was. Deadpool had a lot of appearances in the early X-Force stories. But for Fabian Niciez's run, these themes basically concluded with issue number 43 when he walked away from the title in 1995. And so after Fabian Nicieza stopped writing, the series was taken over by Jeff Loeb. And really, even after Jeff Loeb, it was taken over by a handful of other people like Warren Ellis. The whole idea was looking at this whole situation. The goal was to move the stories in a way where they could build on what Fabian Nicieza had done, but each writer could essentially make it their own. And that's the nature of comics. It's kind of the way those things work. The problem with this was that Marvel, by the time Nicieza left in 1995, and then you had Jeff Loeb who took over, and then you had Warren Ellis who took over. Really, yeah, I'd say Warren Ellis who took over. I think you had John Moore who took over before Warren Ellis did. So Jeff Loeb, John Moore, and then Warren Ellis, I think. Regardless of what order it goes in, the fact remains, you basically ran into a situation where you had Marvel in the midst of the comic bust. And the reason why this matters is because when Marvel was looking at this idea of potentially going bankrupt because, fans almost destroyed the comic book market, Marvel didn't really have the ability to devote full-time resources to comics that weren't necessarily guaranteed to sell. And while X-Force was initially huge when it first picked up, over the course of Fabian Nicisa's run, where artists like Greg Capullo had like amazing, did like an amazing job on the title, you had guys like Tony Daniel, whose art was, kind of moderately received, and then you had a few artists after that. But the sales started to go down. And as the sales started to go down, Marvel started to kind of push in writers who had a name for themselves, like Jeff Loeb, and then start pushing in newer writers and devoting better writers to other publications. It's one of the same reasons why you've got Marvel Knights. Like we've talked about that before. Jimmy Palmiotti, Joe Quesada launched launched Event Publications, basically a way for Marvel to publish stories on superheroes at a cheaper rate for the ones who weren't guaranteed to sell. Daredevil, Punisher, different things like that. This Century, Robert Reynolds, and so on and so forth. And so, really, running up until probably about 2001. For the most part, no, I probably wouldn't even say 2001. Yeah, probably about 2001. For the most part, X-Force just kind of began to consistently drop off. And the whole series was basically canceled and relaunched with issue number 115. Now, the relaunch was really more of like a mini-series, and then after that, the whole series was restarted all over again, but it was done under the writing of a guy named Peter Milligan. The problem with Peter Milligan's writing, and the problem that a lot of fans had with it, was people looked at X-Force and they saw it as like this high-octane, super fast-paced set of events where you had things popping off all the time. You had guys like G.W. Bridge, and you had Shatterstar, and you had all these just super amped up characters who were impossibly large and different things like that. I mean, Nacisa and Greg Capullo kind of fixed that by drawing them in a more proportioned scale as opposed to Rob Liefeld, who basically made Cable like 7 feet tall and 500 pounds of like 0% body fat, who made him just like this massive guy. The fact remains, people didn't really want to see what Peter Milligan had. It was interesting for a little bit, but Peter Milligan really kind of reworked the team into the situation where it was more of like a free-floating kind of, figure out your life and enjoy things, and, whatever happens, happens. And in truth, like people weren't really on board with that. Now, the reason why that worked for what it was, or at least the reason why Marvel went with that, is because in 2001, following the departure, or I would even say in 2004, but in 2001, following the departure of Grant Morrison, Marvel had something called X-Men Reload. And X-Men Reload was basically looking at the entire landscape of the X-Men comics and then just relaunching them. That was the whole idea. We've talked about that before, right? Like, Joe Quesada came in as editor-in-chief and said, okay, what you guys have been doing for the last 10 years is what almost made you bankrupt. So we're going to fix this. And so he went through and literally just started cutting a swath through everything. Peter Parker lost the mirrors to Mary Jane. 98% of the mutant population lost their powers. The Avengers broke up. I mean, it was a massive undertaking in terms of like trying to make it all work. And it was fine. I mean, honestly, I liked a lot of what came out of it. But the fact remains here that under Peter Milligan's writing, the team just didn't really resonate with fans. And a lot of that was because when Joe Quesada sat down and said, what are we going to reinvigorate? What are we not going to reinvigorate? X-Force was on the back burner because it hadn't really been popular since Fabian Nicieza left. And so following this, what Marvel did is, in light of the X-Men Reload, the goal was to rework the entirety of the X-Men mythos. And so for the most part, X-Force kind of took a back burner for like 6 years. It was gone for a long time. You had a miniseries in there somewhere, but basically it was gone. And so this segued into the post-House of M landscape, going into Messiah Complex and Messiah War with Craig Kyle and Chris Yoss run, which I really kind of consider to be X-Force Volume 3, although some people call it X-Force Volume 2, taking into account the miniseries. But in terms of the ongoing X-Force series, it's Volume 2. But the idea of Craig Kyle and Chris Yoss, it was amazing, because what their X-Force team did is it really, for the first time, broke the team away from Cable and said, this is a standalone X-Men team. And so what it did is, it basically maintained the charter of the original X-Force in being like a Black Ops strike force, but it did it without Cable. And so what had happened here is, following the events of House of M, you went into a story called Messiah Complex and then a story called Messiah War. And Messiah Complex was basically the birth of the first mutant after 98% of the mutant population lost their powers. And it was a mad dash for this new mutant who was born. You ended up finding out that Cable was tasked with getting the mutant out of there, and the request was made by Charles Xavier, but because of the fact that this mutant was born after the events of House of M, you had various groups out there who wanted to destroy it because they believed that it was the harbinger of like the resurgence of mutant population. You had groups out there who wanted to kidnap it and use it for experimentation, find a way to duplicate its powers, create more mutant powers, and then you had the X-Men who wanted to capture it so they could keep it safe because they believed that like it was going to be the second rise of the mutant population, and things were going to return to the way they were before Scarlet Witch screwed everything up. And so coming out of that, when it was learned by Cyclops that Cable had kidnapped that Cable had taken the baby and basically was jumping through the time stream, he reformed X-Force using Wolverine, X-23, not Psylocke. I don't think she came until Rick Remender's run, but maybe she did. Anyway, they basically reworked the team, and the idea for the first, really, I think it was about 28 issues that it ran. The idea was you guys are going to, your initial launch of the team is going to be to jump into the future and find Cable, get the baby, and bring it back, which they successfully did. Following that, because the return of X-Force was so popular, and because the story was so well written, Marvel continued it on as long as they could. The issue with this is that they did this in the midst of reworking the X-Men constantly. And so it was only ever going to be a short-lived series because things change all the time. And so what ended up happening is that in issue number 28, by the time that issue came along, the X-Force brand had kind of been expanded on, from its original intention with regards to the launch of Volume 3, and it turned into be a Black Ops team, be a Strike Force team, and serve the purpose of making sure that, one, nobody knows you exist, and two, going through and doing whatever you need to do in order to make sure that no other members of the mutant population are harmed. And again, a team led by Wolverine was massively popular. But following this and going into the launch of really 2010 and the start of Marvel Now, that was the conclusion of Joe Quesada's whole 10-year, decade-long work to reinvigorate Marvel. And so where you had a lot of stories that went in between, where you had things like Fear Itself, where everybody gets a hammer of Thor, and you had all these crazy situations that went on, what you ended up getting was something called the Heroic Age. And the Heroic Age was essentially sitting down and saying, okay, so we had Civil War where Captain America and Iron Man fought over superhuman registration. The bad guys won. Registration went through. That led to the revelation of Secret Invasion, where the shape-shifting Skrull race had replaced a huge chunk of the superhero community, if not all of it, and a pretty good chunk of humanity. That led into the events of Dark Reign, where after Civil War, Iron Man was director of S.H.I.E.L.D., but didn't know Secret Invasion had happened, and so they booted him out, saying he was inept. Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, became director of S.H.I.E.L.D., disbanded it, tried to conquer the world, and that led to the defeat of Norman Osborn following Dark Reign. And so the Heroic Age was kind of Marvel saying, now we're getting back to the age of heroes as you know them. And so it was we've just rediscovered what it means to be Avengers and so on and so forth and different things like that. And for the X-Force team, under Rick Remender, it was kind of reworking it and making things work again. But X-Force was rooted and based in a darker team. And so because of that, while everything else was everybody rediscovering their roles as heroes, the idea of Rick Remender was keep them dark, keep them toned down. And so in the first story arc, they basically assassinate the character that will become Apocalypse. Like Phantom X, a member of X-Force, just shoots him, and that's it. The stories kind of remained in that path, and they stayed relatively dark. When you go after that, when you went after Rick Remender's run, it kind of broke off into a couple of different titles. You had Cable and X-Force, and then Uncanny X-Force, which was the name of the Rick Remender run, Uncanny X-Force. And it served its purpose for what it was. The problem is that by this point in time, popularity in the X-Men in terms of Marvel Comics, it was kind of running stagnant, and it actually has for quite some time. In All New, All Different Marvel, it dropped off almost in its entirety because a lot of people didn't like the direction that Marvel was going in, because they were kind of scuttling back the X-Men and trying to replace them with the Inhumans, which no one liked it because no one cares about the Inhumans, because the Inhumans don't even care about the Inhumans. And so because of that, what you ended up having was an X-Force team that was reminiscent of the 1990s in terms of themes, but none of the stories were compelling. As interesting as they were, Dennis Hopeless, Sam Humphries, who were writing, Cable and X-Force and Uncanny X-Force respectively, it was a line of comics that existed, but it just didn't really work. And Marvel had tried to rework the things on several occasions. For example, after Peter Milligan's run, it was revamped and turned into X-Statix, which was kind of weird. It was basically like a reality TV show version of X-Force. Marvel had tried to rework the team over the years and make it more interesting in an effort to try to kind of capture the Fabian Nicieza run. But the reality of the situation is that the 1990s X-Force team was lightning in a bottle. And from what I see with Deadpool 2, it's basically going to be Fabian Niciza's X-Force. That's really what it looks like it's going to be. The roster may have changed a little bit, but that's basically what it's going to be. It's essentially going to be that version of the team, which is good because that's the one that people are most well aware of. I mean, in truth, I'd say the X-Force team that you see in Deadpool 2 is going to be a combination of the late end of Yeah, of Rob Liefeld's New Mutants, going into like the early launch of X-Force, kind of that in-between period right there. It's basically the version of the team that you're going to see, which in reality is still kind of the same team. It doesn't really change, but still, I mean, it looks like it'll be awesome. I mean, that's kind of what I'm hoping for here. Is it'll give us it'll at least for me anyway, sitting down and looking at Deadpool 2, it'll remind me of the early 90s and really like the mid 90s X-Force run, but at the same time also something, offer something a little bit refreshing and kind of give us a new take. But nonetheless, hopefully this helped you guys out to understand the nature of X-Force and why it exists and the purpose it serves. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.
I'm getting there, guys. Getting there. Getting there indeed. I'm just faffing really now. I don't think I can do much to this else. The tail obviously needs a bit of fluff, but I feel like getting rid of those lines.
What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. So as we continue our segment on Throwback Thursday, where we talk about stories from Marvel and DC before the events of Secret Wars and DC Rebirth, what I want to do here is cover the events of 16 million mutants being massacred, also known as E is for Extinction. Now, E is for Extinction is such a good story.
Let's go on to
the story,
C,
but it marks the first point at which Grant Morrison
off
officially took over the X-Men title. Now, this actually allows us to have a pretty cool conversation about how Marvel almost failed. And this is something that I want to talk about because I was surfing the Marvel subreddit over at reddit.com, and somebody asked a question about Marvel Knights. What's Marvel Knights? How does Marvel Knights tie into the Marvel landscape? Is it official? Is it not official? So on and so forth. So Grant Morrison coming along to Marvel and writing new X-Men coincided with the elevation of a guy named Joe Quesada from being a writer to becoming editor-in-chief. And the reason why is, as we've talked about multiple times before, in the mid-1990s, the comic book industry was quite literally on the verge of collapsing in its entirety, so that comic book companies would just stop publishing comics. A lot of people don't realize how close we were to losing comic books in their entirety. Now, for DC, it was a little easier to navigate these waters and to sort of come out on top because DC had long since been purchased by Warner Brothers, and so they had corporate backing to keep them afloat. Marvel didn't have that. With Marvel Comics, it was quite literally, if we can't sell comics, no one's going to save us. We're going to go under. Now, of course, we know Disney came along sometime later, about a decade or so later, and bought Marvel. But at this point in time, there was no one to keep them afloat. Now, in order to continue providing publications, Marvel also had to start cutting costs, and they had to save money. And so what they did is they took a lot of their characters and they licensed them out to Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, who had a company called Event Comics. And Event Comics created the Marvel Knights line of stories. This is where we got Inhumans Volume 2, which is written by Paul Jenkins, one of the best runs of the Inhumans ever written, really the definitive run. If you ask anybody, what should I read from the Inhumans, they'll likely tell you that's the first thing you should read. That's where we got The Century, Robert Reynolds. That's where we got a lot of the Marvel Knights individual stories with regards to popular characters like Daredevil, Punisher. Now, the Marvel Knights concept was turned into an actual team. Before our discussion here, this is where the Marvel Knights premise originally started. Now, when Joe Quesada was made editor-in-chief, he started like this 10-year-long plan to basically reinvigorate Marvel, because in his mind, the reason why Marvel Comics had seemed to fail was that in addition to the comic bust, the Marvel stories had gotten darker. And so what he wanted to do was kind of begin the process of moving Marvel Comics towards being more lighthearted, but also bringing in various writers. Now, Grant Morrison was already on his A game at this point. I mean, the Justice League of America, the JLA, traditional team as we knew it, had come back, I think, in like 1998 after Crisis on Infinite Earths. So he was already up there at the top. He had Doom Patrol, he had all these things under his belt in order to create great stories, in order to really establish himself as being a formidable writer in his own right. And so E is for Extinction is basically him taking over the X-Men. Now, this is where a lot of you guys will see things like Scott Summers cheating on Jean Grey with Emma Frost with their psychic affair. But more notably than that, Grant Morrison introduced a couple concepts in his run of New X-Men that really changed the game for the X-Men mythos going forward. The first one was Omega level mutants. Prior to this, we simply just had mutants, and there were some who were super powerful, and there were some who were just not very powerful. Beast has agility, agility and he has strength. He has your regular run of superpowers. But then you have like Emma Frost and you have Jean Grey, whose telepathy and telekinesis, really depending on which one you're talking about, is so extreme that it's basically off the charts. Emma Frost's telepathy makes her one of the most telepathic, or one of the most powerful telepaths in the Marvel Universe, if not the most powerful telepath, second really only to Jean Grey. Jean Grey's telepathy and telekinesis, especially when imbued with the powers of the Phoenix Force, make her probably the most powerful mutant within the Marvel landscape, with the exception of those who can warp reality: Franklin Richards, Matthew Malloy, Matt Jim Jasper, so on and so forth. But the other thing that he also did here is he revamped the X-Men team in terms of the physical appearance. As you guys notice, the X-Men are running these weird uniforms, they run different outfits. It was a way to just kind of revamp the team, both physically and within the comics themselves, and it was actually extremely well received. A lot of X-Men fans really look at Grant Morrison's run as a great experience in reading the X-Men comics. Now, with all that aside, with all that having been said, with regards to ES4 Extinction, what we initially do is we actually pick up 30,000 years ago. Now we'll see, we'll find out this is basically a virtual reality segment. This isn't something that's actually happening. They're not traveling in time. But we pick up with some unnamed woman and an unnamed man. And what we're seeing is basically the depiction of evolution. And this is one of the reasons why I love Grant Morrison's run so much, because he had a really good habit of, or I guess a really good way of blending historical truth with meta commentary. And it was really interesting in terms of how he did this, especially with the idea of Cassandra Nova, later on Sublime, so on and so forth. But what he's basically telling us here, at least what this woman, the point that she's making, is that there was a time where Neanderthals were the dominant form of life on Earth. After the Neanderthals came Homo sapiens. But because Homo sapiens were more capable, because they were more intelligent, they were basically able to take out the Neanderthals, push them to the brink of extinction, and then move themselves towards being the dominant power. Now, in reality, as far as I'm aware, assuming that my history is right here, man as we know us, as we know us now, if you choose to ascribe to, evolution, is actually a combination of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, or I guess Cro-Magnon. That's more or less where things came from. They kind of blended together and then formed, evolved into man as we know it today. But the fact remains here that with the situation as it's being presented here by this unnamed woman, who of course we know now is Cassandra Nova, she's essentially saying that in any one given ecosystem there will be a dominant form of life. But when that dominant form of life encounters an evolved organism, that evolved organism will destroy the dominant form of life and take its place. Now, we're actually going to learn that there's a little more to this argument that she has than anything else, but what we do here is we jump back to the regular X-Men themselves. We pick up with Beast, Jean Grey, and Charles Xavier. Now, this is also one of the big changes that Grant Morrison made. He introduced Cerebra. Now, previously it was Cerebro, and Cerebro had powers. It allowed Charles Xavier to look into see mutants, different things like that. But Cerebra was far more capable in the sense that it could allow Charles Xavier to analyze the globe for mutant power. So for those of you guys who saw the X-Men films, when Charles Xavier was analyzing the world as a whole and seeing all the mutants all over the world, that was Cerebra. That was basically the in-movie depiction of Cerebra as it had been created by Grant Morrison. More so than that, Charles Xavier is kind of in an existential crisis here, in the sense that because of all the experiences that he's had, because of all the time the X-Men have tried to create a peaceful coexistence and failed, and Charles Xavier is at a point now where he really wants to push this dream more so than ever. And again, this is really just Grant Morrison highlighting to us the motivations of Charles Xavier, that his idea is to basically create a peaceful coexistence. But what Grant Morrison's also telling us is that the mutant community is alive and growing and is thriving better than it ever was, that there are mutants being born every day. So again, this is just kind of a refresher, kind of a jumping off point. This isn't really like a continuation of sorts. It's basically Grant Morrison providing us with the status quo. Now, while they're analyzing all these different mutant signatures, there's suddenly a massive spike in South America in Ecuador. Now, Beast is initially the only one who catches it. In fact, it's really only for a split second. It's a quick glimpse. Jean Grey misses it, Charles Xavier misses it. But because of the fact that Beast essentially designed this system, because of the fact that Beast is so intelligent, because he's really one of the most trusted members of the X-Men, when he speaks up and he says, there was a large mutant spike over there, we have to figure out what it is, Charles Xavier responds and says, okay, we'll send Cyclops and we'll send Wolverine over there. Now, Cyclops and Wolverine are actually back from a rescue mission in Australia, and they've brought along with them a man named Ugly John. Now, Ugly John is basically just Grant Morrison showing us some of the more bizarre mutations that exist exists with regards to the mutants. Ugly John is basically a guy that has 3 faces in one. He is pretty damn ugly, to be honest with you guys. But the fact remains that because they've been told, or I guess been instructed to deviate away from their return to the Xavier Institute in order to travel to South America, to Ecuador, and to see what it is that's going on, they do exactly that. And so what we do is we transition back to this woman and this man. Now this is where things begin to get really cool, and this is where Grant Morrison starts to expand the story in a really great way. What we learn is that this guy is actually named Donald Trask, and this woman is Cassandra Nova. Now, Grant Morrison won't give us the roots behind Cassandra Nova until later on. Really, it was just introducing her and what her motivations were in this particular story. But Donald Trask is a whole different situation. For those of you guys who are very familiar with the history of Marvel Comics and mutants, Bolivar Trask, and so on, bear with me for a second while I run over this for the people who aren't. So, Bolivar Trask in the history of Marvel Comics has a long-running history in terms of just hating mutants, but he was really the father of the Sentinel program. The idea here was to basically create Sentinels that could track down mutants and could effectively destroy them. The issue with this was that Bolivar Trask was part of a long-running program in the government. And what I mean here is, of course, we actually talked about this on the weekly poll yesterday, which was really cool. But when Kevin Graveau, the writer, came along and introduced Adam Brashear, Blue Marvel, he of course established that Blue Marvel was the original superhero during the 1960s, that his actions went on to inspire the introduction, or I guess the formation of the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Spider-Man, becoming a superhero, so on and so forth, Robert Reynolds becoming the Sentry. He was a huge influence on all those different heroes. But the idea was that because Adam Brashear, because Blue Marvel represented a person with powers that humanity simply couldn't stand against, in response, the U.S. government launched Project Wide Awake. And Project Wide Awake was basically the entire concept of creating Sentinels. It was a joint effort by the National Security Council, the President of the United States, Senator Kelly, I think it was at the time, Bolivar Trask, all these different people who came together, and they officially created the Sentinels for the purpose of quelling the mutant menace, or at the very least keeping mutants in check. The problem with this was that eventually Bolivar Trask was defeated. Now, after he was defeated, his Sentinel plans fell into the hands of a guy named Stephen Lang, and that's really where the introduction of the Phoenix Saga and the start of Chris Claremont's run begins to take off in Marvel Comics here. But the fact remains that because Donald Trask is the nephew of Bolivar Trask, the genes all remain the same. Now, the reason why this matters is not initially revealed to us. Instead, we basically switch back over to Charles Xavier. Now, Charles Xavier conversing, of course, this is done by virtue of his psychic abilities, but Charles Xavier conversing with Wolverine, Cyclops, Beast, Jean Grey, he's essentially telling them that his new motivation here, his goal, is to continue to try to beef up the trust between humans and mutants, but to also look at things that are in the past and keep them in the past. Now, we'll talk about where things reside at this moment right now with regards to the mutant community in Marvel Comics, especially when we get to our segment on Genosha. But the idea behind Charles Xavier's motivations is that if there is a wildly powerful mutant out there that has recently emerged, then the X-Men need to figure out who it is, not necessarily attack that mutant, but figure out who they are and find out where their allegiances lie. Is it a mutant that's wildly powerful but doesn't know how to control their powers? Is it a mutant that's wildly powerful and does know how to control their powers and is leaning towards being a villain? Is there a way that the X-Men can curb those villain tendencies and bring them towards the light to becoming a superhero, or at the very least understanding the responsibility that comes with those abilities? And so again, this basically gives us a reason why Cyclops and Wolverine are going after this mutant as opposed to simply just letting them go. Now, following this meeting between these groups, what ends up happening is, of course, Beast goes off with Jean Grey so that Beast can show Jean Grey his new science lab, so on and so forth. But Charles Xavier is suddenly set upon by presumably the voice of this woman. Now, she says, "Hello again, Charles," indicating the two of them have met before. Maybe.
Okay, guys, I'm going to stop the video here and say thank you very much for watching. I think I'm pretty much done now. Can't think of anything else that I can really tweak to my ability of what I can do on here. So yeah, hopefully you have liked this mashup of animals, thus mutation, which the combination of a crocodile, a penguin, and a lion. So thank you very much to We Can Do It over on Instagram for your request this week, and don't forget to tune in next week for another picture, which will be a combination of another 3 animals. I can't think of what they are at the top of my head, but we have had a request already from what's his name on Instagram? The Art Hutch. He's another artist, and we've been chatting, and I asked him for a request, and he gave me a request of 3 other animals. Tune in next week to see what animals it's going to be, and hopefully if you've liked this, to leave a like. If you want to see any more, guys, don't forget to hit subscribe and check up in the playlist. If you're watching back, guys, don't forget to hit my face, which will appear in the middle, or it will be my insignia, which you'll see on my channel. Hit that to subscribe, or just hit down below. Leave a comment down below on what you want to see next time or next month, as we're coming close to the end of this month and we're going into another theme for next month. I'm not sure what it's going to be. It could be anything, guys. I don't really know. But if you have a request, then let me know down below in the comment section. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you next time. Click the links and I'll see you again. Bye for now.